Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Associate Counsel at the Freedom from Religion Foundation here in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dan, Director of Governmental Affairs at FFRF in Washington, D.C. On today's show, Building a Better Judiciary, we have the mighty Lena Zwarensteyn, the Fair Courts Director from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. The Leadership Conference is a coalition of more than 230 national organizations committed to promoting and protecting the civil and human rights of all persons in the United States. FFRF is a proud member of the Leadership Conference, and one of the Leadership Conference's founders was A. Philip Randolph, a noted free thinker. Lena led advocacy efforts to stand up to the Trump administration's judicial nominations, including Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett. Now Lena is in the driver's seat on judicial nominations. We'll talk with her today about the gains the Biden administration has made to promote fair judges who are committed to protecting the rights of all of us, a particular challenge after the past few years where Trump made it a feature to appoint Christian Nationalist judges. We'll also talk about the importance of diversifying the federal bench and some of the obstacles candidates of color have been facing in their nominations as well. Plus, we'll be talking with her about how we can prepare for a potential SCOTUS nomination. Lena can be found on Twitter at Lena Zwarensteyn. And even though this is Ask an Atheist, Lena does not identify as a non-believer. And Lena, we are thrilled to have you on Ask an Atheist, so welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Liz. And I really appreciate all you have done and contributed to our really vast Fair Courts Coalition, as well as the Leadership Conference. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Thanks. And just a reminder, if you have questions for Lena, you can ask them in the Facebook comments, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And of course, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. So not only do we happily accept your donations, we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections. We don't endorse or oppose candidates, and of course don't necessarily endorse views to that end that might be expressed here by other guests. So FFRF, we're going to talk about building a better judiciary and hopefully some hopeful points about the current administration. But like a lot of other organizations, we at FFRF published a report in December of 2020 discussing the threat to secular government that's facing us thanks to the packing of the federal bench with ultra-conservative judges. And you can check that report out at ffrf.us.liberty. And we're also working on an update to our webpage, just talking about the damage that has already been done just in the past year. And of course, this week marks the 1-year anniversary of Amy Coney Barrett's ascension to the Supreme Court. So we're going to talk about the numbers first and the impact of Trump's judges, how the Trump administration transformed the judiciary and what we've seen in the past year. Of course, we've talked about this on this show before, but Trump, along with McConnell, of course, was able to confirm 3 Supreme Court justices, totally remaking the Supreme Court, 54 appeals court judges, 174 district court judges, 3 judges on the Court of International Trade, not to be overlooked. So now more than a quarter of currently active federal judges are Trump appointees. So let's just talk first. How are the effects of Trump judges being felt by the American people already these past few years?
There have been some really incredibly cruel decisions that the court has already rendered on a number of issues. If we just look back for the past few months, obviously what we're seeing happen in Texas with the really cruel SB 8 legislation is putting people's health at risk by really effectively making sure that nobody in Texas can get an abortion. We also see this with another ruling that the Supreme Court had back in August on its shadow docket, which means that they didn't have a real chance to actually listen to arguments, where effectively millions of people will be evicted from their homes because the Supreme Court decided that the eviction moratorium must end. And on the issue, obviously, of separation of church and state, we know that these Trump judges have been put there, to your point, for an agenda, this very cruel agenda. And we're seeing that the Supreme Court is going to be taking up a number of cases in this term about the separation of church and state, and may be poised to do so. We know that the effects have just begun, and it's going to continue. And it's why we need to be so focused on this for both the short term as well as long term as we build an equal justice judiciary.
Right. I'll just jump in and point out, thanks, Lena, for setting it up, which is from FFRF's perspective, of course, this court, not only the Supreme Court, but the balance of most of the courts of appeal now, are really eager to address cases that deal with or argue for religious privilege, really, but religious exemptions to neutral laws. We've seen this a lot just over the past 12 months with COVID restrictions, public health laws, and exemptions from them for religious reasons. And a surprising amount of that activity has been at the Supreme Court level, really, not just, they're not waiting for a lot of these cases to wend their way up circuit courts or present conflicts amongst the circuit courts. They're jumping right at these cases. We're seeing that in the abortion context, I think, a lot sooner than most of us hoped. The court is poised to hear an abortion case, the SB 8 case, which deals with a 6-week abortion ban, effectively outlawing abortion in Texas, next week. They've accelerated their review of some initial issues in that case. And then next month, they're hearing the 15-week abortion ban case out of Mississippi. And those two laws were both thought or are both clearly unconstitutional under the court's decades-long abortion jurisprudence. And we know that here at FFRF, we think of reproductive access as a secular issue. And we know that the organized opposition to abortion in this country is really undergirded by religious ideology and a religious idea about when life begins, and embedding that into legislation to the detriment of so many people. So we're seeing the court really jump at the opportunity to review these cases that otherwise have been settled law for a long time.
That's exactly right. And it is by design, as you said, when you have the judges who come with a particular agenda, one that is, not very much in favor of making sure that there is a separation of church and state, or one that is very likely to, because they have a demonstrated record of being anti-civil and human rights. We know that the arguments are becoming even more emboldened in the courts, that the cases that are being brought in the courts are even more extreme because the judges have become more extreme. So we are seeing in many cases some very cruel decisions that have already been handed down at the district courts, the appellate courts, and at the Supreme Court. And it's really this real acceleration to chip away some of our fundamental rights that's at risk, which you've already identified, and why we are all fighting so hard. Right.
So let's talk about appointments, and maybe we can toggle back to some of the cases that we've seen over the past year and what's going on this term, because there's not much we can do at this point about the Supreme Court. But just on the federal bench appointments, where are we with the Biden administration? We know that the Democrats barely have the Senate. So what does this look like in terms of how many judges Biden has been able to appoint versus Trump's accelerated pace at this same point in his presidency?
Thanks to the advocacy of organizations like yours and the entire Fair Courts Coalition that we have done, and just people making calls, this administration has really heeded the calls to make sure that they are quickly selecting and nominating and confirming judges who have a commitment to civil and human rights, who are reflective of our vast diversity in our country and have different professional diversity to bring to the bench. And so far, just before we got on air, the Senate confirmed its 25th lifetime nominee this year. That's truly remarkable. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have 7 new circuit court judges in this, thanks to this administration, and more district court judges, more to come. And I will say, by comparison, you don't really want to totally measure yourself by what the Trump administration did, especially when it comes to our democracy. But this administration has really put a focus on the judiciary and making it more fair. Trump, in his first year, in total, only had confirmed 18 lifetime judges at the lower court level. So already we're surpassing that number. But as you mentioned already, the Senate is only 50-50 every single day. You never know what you're going to get. So time is of the essence. It is like climbing a bit out of a hole, but every single judge that is confirmed that has a demonstrated commitment to civil rights, that it is reflective of our community, not only builds public trust, but makes better decisions for all of us. And so it really is critical that this remain a priority for the foreseeable future.
Right. We know that the problem with the court packing that happened over the last 4 years was a problem of quantity and quality. You mentioned professional diversity. I mean, we haven't seen much professional diversity going back a few presidents now, but Trump was especially poor is like a euphemism for his record on judicial appointments when it actually came to just racial diversity, a really overwhelmingly white male pool of federal judges. What are we seeing differently from the Biden administration?
Liz, you're exactly right. 65% of Trump's judges were white men.
Yeesh.
About 85% were white. And there really was this, I think, rewarding of attorneys who were really taking up causes, whether that was anti-abortion, anti-voting, right, and so on and so forth. So you were right. It was both a quality and quantity consideration. What we have seen and what we have demanded for many, many years as a coalition is that this White House and senators actually select people from a diverse area of legal practice. That means people who do have experience representing, certainly a lot of different interests, whether that's on reproductive freedom, on the freedom to vote. We just this week had confirmed an incredible nominee, now Judge Myrna Perez, who led a lot of the voting rights efforts for the Brennan Center, which really was at the forefront of making sure our freedom to vote was protected. Those are the types of judges we need to see, but we need to see more, to be quite honest. We have a number of cases coming up that at the Supreme Court and throughout our lower courts that involve disability rights. It's incredibly important to make sure that we have judges that reflect all different types of backgrounds, disability, faith or no faith, and that we have people who have sort of lived experience that's really important to informing judicial decisions. Hopefully later this week, we will see the first openly lesbian appellate court nominee confirmed to the bench. It's absolutely ridiculous we're having that conversation in 2021,
Wow.
But it is so important that somebody like Justice Beth Robinson, who led the path to marriage equality in the state of Vermont, does get onto our circuit courts, because the experience she will bring to bear, I think, will really spell a lot of obviously good law and a lot of it really forebodes, I think, really well for where our judiciary is headed. But we need to do more and more and more.
So
Wonderful.
on
Thank
that
you so
note,
much.
Mark, why don't you set up our clip? We have some footage from one of the exciting recent confirmation hearings.
All right. And before that, if you do have any questions for Lena Zwarensteyn from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And so let's talk a little bit more about some of the Biden nominees. We have a clip that Bruce is setting up from the confirmation hearing of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was nominated and confirmed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. To set up the clip, Lena, talk a little bit about why Judge Jackson Brown was such a critical nominee and why the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit is so important.
Yeah, the D.C. Circuit decides a lot of critical issues, whether that is on regulations that help dictate whether or not we will have clean air or clean water, or what the federal government most recently has done in terms of protecting voting rights. And so all of the courts, all of the judges are really important, but the DC Circuit in particular hears a lot of litigation around federal legislation and federal regulations, so it can really have national consequence. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was recently confirmed to the DC Circuit. We were very excited. She was the first judge to be confirmed. She had previously been sitting on the district court for the District of Columbia, and had a number of cases where she upheld rule of law and equal justice in cases that I know some may find to be controversial. But before that time, she served on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. She was a public defender. She has experience in the criminal legal system and has really fought to make sure that our criminal legal system improves, to remove disparities that we know persist, especially for communities of color. And her advocacy in those ways has really been remarkable to changing the type of law. So her being on the DC Circuit is absolutely remarkable. We were so excited to see her confirmed in June.
Great. And in this clip during her confirmation hearing, she talks about having a different kind of experience than most judges. Okay, let's roll the clip.
I would say that my different professional background than many of the Court of Appeals judges, including my district court background, which will be different if I'm confirmed than many of my colleagues, would bring value. It's sort of like the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote that the life of the law is not logic, it's experience. And so I've experienced life in perhaps a different way than some of my colleagues because of who I am. And that might be valuable. I hope it would be valuable if I was confirmed to the court, the circuit court.
Thank you.
And often federal judges are described as having a background that is male, pale, and Yale. And then they often come from very elite white shoe law firms. That seems to be changing under Biden. So can you talk a little bit about that, and why does her experience matter, and how has this type of experience been overlooked in the past?
Judge Jackson is exactly right. Her type of experience, the conversations she can have with her colleagues, the other judges, help do a number of things that is actually borne out in research. There's a professor, Maya Sen, who's done a lot of work on this that talks about the incredible rich diversity of that is professional, experienced, lived. When there is a diversity of viewpoints on the bench, it improves judicial decision making. The other aspect that I think is important is it improves the public trust. Right now, the public trust for the Supreme Court in particular is at a real low. But when you have judges that look like you, look like the communities they serve, it can truly bolster it. And so this administration, even before the inauguration, this administration put a real premium on making sure senators knew they wanted something different. And this is after years of advocacy that many of us have done to say we need to make sure we have demographic diversity on our bench. For too long, the default of who was considered to be a fair judge was, as you said, white and male. That is not the case. Justice looks like all of us. And so it was really important that the White House send that message to all the senators to say, we are serious. We want to be making sure the nominees that you have criminal justice experience, particularly as public defenders, civil rights lawyers. We need more balance. The default of fairness is not what we have seen before. And for us to actually not only feel like we have more fairness in our courts, but actually have fair decisions, we need to be making sure that the bench looks like our communities.
So right. So before Judge Brown Jackson was nominated to the DC Circuit Court, she, as she mentioned in the clip, held positions on the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and of course she's a district court judge, which means she's been confirmed by the Senate before. Her nomination to those positions was overwhelmingly confirmed, sometimes by a voice vote. This nomination, the Court of Appeals for DC Circuit, was so much closer, more partisan, 13-9 on the Judiciary Committee and 53-44 on the Senate floor. What do we make of that, Lena? What's going on with these confirmation hearings in the Senate at this point?
The process has become more and more tense. What we saw over the 4 years of the Trump administration was a Senate majority, in that case, led by Mitch McConnell, and having both Senate Judiciary Committee chairs Grassley as well as Graham really eviscerate a number of the norms that we have seen that the Senate Judiciary Committee had previously established, ones that do promote, more vetting of nominees and questioning and so on. And so the past few years have been very, very vicious. But thankfully, many of us were standing up, calling it out for what it was. It was a real agenda to roll back our civil and human rights, which we are seeing happen because of the decisions that they're making. And now I think that we are seeing these votes that should be unanimous be barely get through. And I think it's really an unfortunate symptom of a bigger problem about the types of conversations, who people do think is actually fair. I do think we're seeing throughout a number of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings a lot of hostility, especially towards women and women of color in particular. And so I really do think that this is a more concerted effort to try to stop the Biden administration, but they're more or less fearful of what these types of judges will do. And that is, our hope is to bring more equality, a fair-mindedness to the bench, and to be making sure that really the role of the judiciary to be fair and independent is actually upheld.
You mentioned women of color, Lena, and this is somewhere else in our outline, but I don't want to miss it because it blew me away when I saw what this confirmation marks in terms of Black women on the federal bench. Can you talk about those numbers and how unbelievably unrepresentative they are at this point?
Liz, you're so right. And this is another thing I really regret we're having to say in 2021, that this administration has doubled the number of Black women serving on our circuit courts. It's appalling that this administration came in and there were only 4 Black women serving in about just less than 200 seats across our country administering justice. And now there's 8. Which is huge. However, we obviously want to be making sure there's more. Judge Jackson, who we saw earlier, was the first Black woman to be confirmed to our circuit courts in 10 years.
That is crazy.
It's really remarkable. But this sort of dedication to be making sure we are finding these incredibly qualified, diverse nominees who bring a real richness and understanding of what people in their courtroom may be facing, I think is really, really, really important. This week we saw a number of excellent women of color nominees confirmed. Myrna Perez, who will be only the second Latina to serve on the second court. We saw recently, last week, an AAPI judge be confirmed to the state of Washington's Western District. And we're seeing more and more women of color in particular be confirmed. I will say it's a bit remarkable. The 24th nominee to be confirmed was the first white man to be confirmed to this administration. Everybody else was a woman of color, or a judge of color, now a judge of color, which I think is really, really remarkable. It's one step towards helping rebalance, or at least start balancing our courts, which is really important and can't be overstated.
Wow.
And what do the Senate Democrats have to do that's different and harder than other administrations have had to contend with? What's happening on the floor, and how do they have to line themselves up to get a lot of these nominees out of committee onto the floor and start working?
Mark, it is so time consuming. It takes a lot, to be quite honest, to do a lot of the vetting, the selection, the pipeline work to make sure that we are getting good candidates so we get good judges out of it. And so senators do have to spend a lot of time that you may never see. But Mark, as you're mentioning, there's a lot that has to happen and that the Senate is trying to do. It's crucial that the Senate pass voting rights legislation, for example, that they pass budgets that actually help people and their families and so on. And so it's really important that they do this. But one thing we have always emphasized is how important it is to make sure that these lifetime judges are confirmed, because they do decide these very issues. So the time commitment is really, really, really difficult. But what we saw in the last administration was a near laser focus and sole focus on judges. That's not what this country needs. This country needs to be making sure we have good legislation in addition to good judges. And so what I've been encouraged to see, although there have been some real unfortunate stallings and a lot of major legislation we need passed, is that there is an attention to both making sure bills that help all of us are passed in addition to these judges, because it can't be one or the other. It really has to be both. And we've seen already that you can do both at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that always points to what we've been saying in our meetings on the Hill, that you could have the best legislative ideas on the planet, and if it goes the distance, if it passes both chambers, gets signed into law by the president, it can easily be knocked out by a court that's quite frankly making up its own rules. And that's why judiciary judges have become a high priority for FFRF, and also judicial reform packages like the Judiciary Act of 2021 by Representative Johnson from Georgia, which seeks to expand the Supreme Court. So those are items we are moving forward on the Hill, and with a lot of our folks and supporters as well. So if you have any questions for Lena Zwarensteyn from the Leadership Conference on Human Rights, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. All right. We have another clip from Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's hearing. And in this clip, Senator Cornyn from Texas is asking about what role race would play in her judicial decision-making, which we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but very odd. All right, let's roll the clip.
What role does race play, Judge Jackson, in the kind of judge that you have been and the kind of judge you will be?
Thank you, Senator. I don't think that race plays a role in the kind of judge that I have been and that I would be in the way that you ask that question. As I mentioned to Senator Feinstein, I'm doing a certain thing when I get my cases. I'm looking at the arguments, the facts, and the law. I'm methodically and intentionally setting aside personal views, any other inappropriate considerations, and I would think that race would be the kind of thing that would be inappropriate to inject in my evaluation of a case. I would say that my different professional background than many of the Court of Appeals judges, including my district court background, which will be different if I'm confirmed than many of my colleagues, would bring value. It's sort of like the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote that the life of the law is not logic, it's experience. And so I've experienced life in perhaps a different way than some of my colleagues because of who I am. And that might be valuable. I hope it would be valuable if I was confirmed to the court, the circuit court.
Wow. Her composure answering that question is remarkable. That line of questioning is so disturbing, and it just shows the sort of quiet but really hostile backlash to what you mentioned, Lena, which is the striking fact that only one white male has come up for nomination under this administration, and some of the old white male senators don't like it.
That's right. And watching that clip, I remember watching it in real time and having a very visceral reaction. You know, Senator Cornyn, next to Judge Jackson was another candidate, Candace Jackson Akumi, who's now been confirmed to the Seventh Circuit, also a Black woman. And he asked both of them, and you're right, it is, to me, absolutely unfair that these women of color have to sit there and be composed when they're being asked a question that would not be asked of certainly white nominees, and that haven't been asked of white nominees. But it really is, I think, a symptom of what you're saying, that there is a real hostility. Senator Cornyn made, in that case, you know, having him ask the question, he's like, well, that's what I thought you would say, and tried to play it off. But just the fact of asking that really shows what your default of fairness is. And in his mind, that means obviously a white judge. And this is a pattern that we have seen time and time and time again, unfortunately. So it's not a one-off, but it is something that keeps happening, especially for nominees of color, nominees who the senators have been saying lack temperament because of something perhaps that they said, which is very hard to sit and watch and hear, having gone through numerous hearings previously, including the one where now Justice Kavanaugh was yelling at senators and calling them out specifically. And so I think on that issue of temperament, we are seeing so many of this racist and sexist beliefs get really seen out there. You said it's kind of quiet, but it's still it's not hidden.
It's gross.
We can see it, and we need to call it out.
Yeah, it's gross and it's so harmful. And when I just think about the composure that the judge showed compared to what we saw in now Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, it's just appalling. But it's kind of good to see, though, that nominees are able to handle those questions and remain composed and still somehow push back. I mean, she kind of made reference to the way in which he's asking the question, which is, not to let this pass, which is, well, I don't think that happens in the way in which you're asking the question, Senator, i.e., you're suggesting that I can't be fair because I'm Black, basically. And I'm just curious, what have you seen this type of racist questioning in other nomination hearings, and how do you think nominees can or do prepare for these types of questions?
Yeah, it's a pattern. So it's not a bug in this case. I do think it is a feature. We have seen this, especially being sort of used against women and women of color for judicial nominees. We've also seen it with executive nominees. There's often this line where they say, well, I just don't believe you, after a nominee, especially women of color, have answered questions. I don't believe that you really are sorry when you said you're sorry for that tweet, for example. Or I really don't believe that you really meant what you're saying here right now. I don't see how you could rule in this way and tell me right now you will be fair. It's this real line of, I don't trust you, I don't believe you, and it comes up time and time again. I personally am worried in many ways that obviously this is harming the nominee. I do remind myself that when senators are asking this question, they're usually not actually trying to have an honest conversation with the nominee. They're trying to deliver and perhaps put out those dog whistles, or those very not dog whistles, the ones we all hear happening, to signal what they're doing. But a nominee can really prepare, I think, in a few ways. One is to know that this is going to come up, whether it is the racist and sexist. There have been a number of questions specifically perpetuating hate against trans people and the LGBTQ community even more broadly. There have been a lot of nominees who, on the topic of faith, they are people of faith, but then they will get questions about that. Well, how can you really say this and also believe this or have done this? And it's that type of insidiousness that I think is really difficult. But I think nominees had to be prepared to answer everything. They know that their job as a judge is to be a fair-minded jurist. If they're district court judges, be a fact finder and make sure you are creating a good record. And that's really important. And one reason why we need to have people who are very thoughtful, intentional, and really can do and evaluate science and facts as it comes up, because the record that they're creating, what type of testimony they admit, the types of, expert witnesses they allow to testify are really, really important, because it can shape the outcome later or down the road. But it really is, I think, important for the judges to know, okay, my role as a judge is to look at the law and the facts. But I think what Judge Jackson did to say is, I'm aware that my experience, my lived and professional experience is going to bring to bear another perspective that will help and improve my colleagues on the bench when they're analyzing this. I can engage in a rich conversation with them if they have questions, if we can have this conversation as we're talking about the law. And I think that's ideally what senators should be looking for in terms of the nominees, who can help achieve a better balance, and I don't even want to call it balance, a better, more deliberative, judicial decision-making body, and having people with those types of backgrounds is absolutely critical. I know that there are a few judges out there, some who've recently taken senior status, which is unfortunate, but there are, for example, Judge Bernice Donald of the Sixth Circuit, Judge McKee from the Third Circuit. They're out talking a lot about people's implicit biases, including and especially judges, because those are their colleagues. When you have somebody who's on the bench and they have told their own stories of how they have been the only Black judge to be sitting in a courtroom and have defendants come in, and it's the first time they've seen a Black judge, somebody who looks like them, and how that in and of itself can be incredibly life-changing for the defendant, let alone the types of decisions that are being made. So I think it's so important to not overstate how important that is in terms of the types of decisions, the types of public trust people have. But, huge applause to those who have gone through the process. I hope that those folks who are considering becoming judges aren't deterred because of the types of questions that they are being asked, but they do damage. Having hateful things out there obviously contributes really negatively to the discourse. But I am hoping that, especially younger people of color, younger attorneys, and, kids out there even who think that maybe this is a path I can pursue now that I'm seeing people who look like me, that over time this changes. Right now it's important for advocates like us to call it out for what it is. But I do think it's really important that we make sure that for our long term, for there to be better judges, and for there to be equal justice and justice administered, that we do have more nominees who understand, wait a minute, this is really important. And the last thing I'll say is a number of questions that have come up in these hearings revolve around, do you believe systemic racism is real? And I think that goes to a lot of the implicit bias, where there are senators who just refuse to think that institutions themselves can perpetuate racism, sexism, and all of the things that we know are structurally holding back people and have historically and currently being used to marginalize people, whether that is women, LGBTQ people, or people of faith or no faith, right? Like those types of institutions can really and have been founded. Our judiciary was founded to protect the interests of white supremacy and people with money in particular. And so really understanding the ways in which those dynamics are at play, I think, is really important for anybody who steps foot in a courthouse and understands it. But to just have senators who can outright dismiss the fact that systemic racism, that implicit bias exists, is really, to me, very, very shocking. And having to watch nominees go through that line of questioning too has been upsetting.
Yeah, it's frustrating because this is just me on my soapbox, and then we'll go to questions. But the whole confirmation hearing process there's sort of this understanding that we've become so polarized, and the whole process has become, this political stage that it's all just kabuki theater. It's like there's no real kind of searching and advise and consent process going on in there. It's really just a way for senators to signal political things and displeasure about certain groups of people. And you remind me of it when you're talking about senators saying, well, I don't believe you that you're sorry about that tweet you sent, advocating for something other than corporatist things. You know what I mean? It's just, and the judges probably are like, yeah, you're right. I'm not sorry that I advocated on Twitter for civil rights of human beings. The whole thing is just theater. And it's so, I feel for these nominees because they're, professional jurists who have dedicated their lives to, civil rights or whatever it may be. And the truth is, so many of these senators really just are not comfortable that some of these nominees have spent their lives advocating for minority groups or minority viewpoints or minority rights, and not something that just reflects the corporatist white worldview. So I hate the whole thing.
All right. And if you have questions for Lena Zwarensteyn from the Leadership Conference, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist at ffrf.org. And do we have any questions from the audience?
I'm going to check it out here. Okay, let's see. Yeah, we've got a couple questions. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot so we have time to get to these. Oh boy. Someone, Anne, asked the question, what is, or is there a procedure for removing a seated federal judge? What grounds could be used for that? Lena?
That's a really good question.
Asking for a friend.
Yeah, asking for a friend. I received this question quite a lot over the past few years. Unfortunately, it's really, really hard to remove a federal judge. They serve lifetime based on how the Constitution is written. It says judges serve during, quote, during good behavior, which has been really interpreted to mean lifetime. So they sit there, and the way to remove them as prescribed by the Constitution is through impeachment. So we already know, having gone through this process with the former president a few times, that is really hard. You do have to bring up charges in the House, obviously has to go through its process, and then it goes to the Senate for conviction, potentially. There have been instances in the past, but less than 10, where federal judges have been removed. Often at times it's for criminal behavior, such as domestic violence. There are other times where we have seen, for example, the issue of workplace discrimination and harassment is pervasive, and it's certainly known to happen in the federal judiciary. It's been very hard, and there are numerous great calls and improved accountability measures being taken, but sometimes a judge can evade that by just simply retiring and not, necessarily being formally impeached, which means they may still be paid and still be able to enjoy other benefits of having, be seen as a judge and not having been formally impeached or held accountable in these other ways, which I think is really, really hard. So unfortunately, the answer is it's really hard. I will say that there are a lot of things people, we should be very cognizant of. I think knowing and calling out bad behavior is important because it can help Congress and enact better and stricter laws. So I know that there is recently a bill introduced where a number of district court judges did not recuse themselves from cases where they had a financial interest. That has prompted Congress to act, which I think is important. Other disclosures I think can be really helpful. So at a minimum, there's transparency, but when there's more transparency, there's a better chance of accountability as well. So we need to see more measures like that in order to at least be making sure we're paying attention to what's happening in our judiciary and there's not carte blanche to abuse that power.
Lena,
and that's also why FFRF, we are a proud sponsor of Hank Johnson's Judicial Ethics Act. So, and that addresses a lot of the concern, and it also ties more, it creates a uniform standard for judges across the federal government.
So true, because Lena, am I wrong that right now judges kind of set their own ethics rules?
That's correct. There is a lot. There are a code of conduct that federal judges, in particular the lower court judges, adhere to. There is a judicial council or conference that helps evaluate the types of rules and such that they have some measures by which that they can help enforce. A lot of that does not apply to the Supreme Court. So there have been numerous calls by us and others to have the Supreme Court adopt ethics code and code of conduct so that they are held accountable at a minimum to the standards that the lower courts are. But that is something that is being debated right now. Many people think that the court should be left to its own devices to not only create their own rules, but as you're saying, Liz, like to make sure that they're the ones who are enforcing that too. And it creates a bit of a problem, which is why we need some of these other, like the Judicial Accountability Act and others that and we need to see them be seriously considered because there really is a problem. I think people already, we know through a lot of research and polling that we do, a lot of people understand that the courts aren't working for them, and it's for a variety of reasons, such as the types of interests that they have, whether they're financial or other, or this lack of accountability for bad behavior.
So since we're on this topic, Lena, let's just wrap up with, is there hope for any of these judicial reforms? I know they run the gamut from, extreme to really administrative, but is there hope of any of these reforms passing or gaining traction, or, public support, all that?
I think so. I think there is a lot of public support for a number of the reform measures. I'll note that I think that typically speaking, in order for people to actually have or get closer to the day where there is equal justice, whether or not you ever enter into a courthouse, or just the types of decisions that we know impact you, whether that is equal pay, where you're able to access your health care, if you're able to access your health care, and so much more. It really is, I think, just really important that people have that faith, obviously, in the courts. And so I do think that there is an understanding that the courts aren't there right now. And so there is likely a lot of will to pass this. I know senators, in some situations, some of the bills do have even bipartisan support, but we need to continue to make the case that, one, we need more lower court judges, the caseload. We need to just at a minimum, modernize our courts. COVID, in particular, this pandemic, has really thrown a number of wrinkles into our court system, created a tremendous backlog, plus changing populations. It's really important that our courts are actually structured to meet the demand. So I do think it is possible. I will say what we know is probably the biggest lever of change that we can already act upon is who is filling these vacancies. We have, I've already mentioned 25 and more lifetime confirmations to come, but there are a number of vacancies still yet to be filled. So if we can be making sure that the judges who sit in those seats, or future seats should they be created, have a commitment to civil and human rights, that they are reflective of all of our communities and all of us, that's the best way, I think, to be making sure, using the tools we have and the opportunities we have, to be making a bit of difference. And hopefully we can do more to modernize our courts, when it comes to transparency and ethics and just the sheer number of judgeships, especially at that lower court level.
Right on. That is a great place to leave it, Lena. So I'm going to wrap it up for the week. And thank you so much for joining us. I love talking with you. And this was a little more hopeful than our last chat. So that was nice.
Absolutely. And I really just want to take a moment to thank you, all of your supporters, and everyone else. Really, our fight for a fair judiciary, and one that does provide equal justice, is really up to all of us to participate. FFRF has been a fantastic member of the Leadership Conference and partner in all of this work for our fight for fair courts. And, it is something that we have had a number of years of really hard fights. But it's because of those hard fights that we are seeing some success today. And it's the only hope we have in order to one day be coming together to talk about the good court cases that are coming down and the good decisions and so on. So I really just want to thank you. This is both short-term work and finding the opportunities that we have, but this really is the work of a generation, and just really appreciate you for being great partners in it.
Thank you.
We always enjoy being great partners with the Leadership Conference, and we're so happy you could be here with us. Last time you were here, we asked you, are we doomed? And it seems the answer is we're not 100% out of the woods, but we're not doomed. And some days it just felt like, man, we are going on the defensive for just about everything. So it's nice not to be in a purely defensive posture. We can get really good folks into the judiciary, making good decisions, and a judiciary that's more reflective of all of us rather than some of us. So, Lena, it's always been a pleasure. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
And be sure to check out FFRF's broadcast TV program, Free Thought Matters. This week, we are re-airing our 2020 show with the late great actor, activist, and free thinker, Ed Asner.
Having been raised as an Orthodox Jew, I know the fervor of what intensity can create. And it was easy to just take from the Orthodox Jew and put it into the Orthodox Christian. And I'm not sure how Orthodox he was anyway. It's also blatantly plain how people can follow the God and turn him into a false idol.
That was Ed Asner talking about playing William Jennings Bryan in a play about the Scopes monkey trial. You can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations around the U.S. on Sunday mornings or on FFRF's YouTube and Facebook channels. Check out also Free Thought Radio, FFRF's weekly radio show, and it's a podcast. You can find it at ffrf.org/radio. Dan and Annie Laurie's guest this week will be Bart Worden. He's the president of the American Ethical Union. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as usual, you can check out our website at ffrf.org. We will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Freedom from religion.